Watch this video to find out the top 5 things you need to know before you sign your next warehouse lease. Ron from Rohde Law, and if you follow this channel, you know that I post about all things commercial real estate, triple net leasing, and in particular industrial, my favorite asset class. So this video is going to be the top things to consider when leasing a warehouse space. And when I say warehouse, I'm going to include that with distribution. I'm not going to get into too much semantics, but the main things, according to Chad Griffiths, is clear height. Now, in the lease, it is probably not going to spell out clear height. Instead, the lease is going to require you to take the space as is. So you need to make sure that you go into the facility and you measure what is often the lowest height in the main storage area. So what I mean is, if there is equipment, if there are other protrusions, the advertised clear height of 34 feet or 20 feet may not be the lowest point, but that is often how you measure is the lowest point in the storage area. So you need to make sure that if you're expecting a clear height to be a certain number, you need to go in and measure it yourself, because the lease is not going to protect you if all of the advertising says 20 feet, but you go in and the actual clear height is 19 feet. You're not going to be protected, or you're not going to have a means to get out of the lease. Number 2 is dock doors. This can seem very straightforward. You go out, you look on site, you've got to count the number of doors. But I'll tell you, not every dock door is created equally. So you need to check the mechanisms. You need to get a PCR report, a PCA. You need to have an engineer working those doors, measure each opening, and make sure that they're all the same. Because visually you may look at it, but the height from the ground, from the grade level, may not all be the same. It may require the dock leveler. And even if it works with the dock leveler, if you have a huge incline and a steep ramp, that is not going to make your loaders happy. And again, the lease is not going to have any provisions to get you out for dock leveling, adjustment height, the opening of the door, that sort of thing. And number 3, power supply. Actually, this is where your lawyer can help you now, because delivered power at the building is in the lease. And oftentimes we do specify the number of amps that are delivered at the building level. And so if you require 3-phase 480, a certain 600 amps or 1200 amps of power delivery, that can be put in the lease, and that can be a very clear, testable, enforceable landlord obligation is power delivery. Okay, let's go through some other things. Security. For most single tenant buildings, even for multi-tenant, you're not going to get security. Those are not going to be a landlord obligation. And so you need to make sure that you have a budget for installing your own security and maintaining that equipment on the exterior of the building. If you're going to install anything, make sure you have landlord consent, not to be unreasonably withheld for installing those security cameras. HVAC. Again, another common situation. You're going to have a credit for TI for each HVAC, but read the lease to see who is responsible for the capital expenditure of the actual equipment. Now, if this equipment is on the roof, you're going to, again, need to have a maintenance service contract in most cases, but you need to be clear about what types of repairs are typically tenant expenses, but what type of replacement is typically a landlord expense. Square footage. So this is something that we run into a lot, especially on flex multi-tenant buildings. You have something called a load factor, which is the difference between the premise square foot and the rentable square footage. And there's going to be a load factor. And so you should understand, what are you paying for? And that is often a higher number than the actual square footage that you measure inside the facility. But anywhere a load factor, 10 to 20%, again, it depends on how many subdivision, how many subunits there are. If you're a single tenant, you're going to have a lot more flexibility on that. But check your BOMA standards, because that is typically the language that we see in leases for what is the actual rentable square footage and what are you paying for as calculated. Do you have an audit right to adjust that, maybe one time during the life of the lease, to adjust that rentable square footage? Maintenance expenses, a huge category. You always like a detailed list of hypothetical expenses. What are tenant expenses and what are landlord expenses? Loading docks, again, who is responsible for maintenance of this, and is there a negligent standard for use of the dock? What I see a lot is allegations of improper use the truck causing damage. And one of those factors are going to be what are the standards and what type of users are backing up. Because if it's a third party, then it puts both the tenant and landlord in a bad situation where some third party has potentially damaged the dock door or the leveler. And so that puts a very clear disadvantage to the tenant, because you get in this he said, she said, and it's kind of a finger pointing. Versus if you're going to be a single tenant user, if you are all employing your own trucks, your own drivers, that is a better situation to say, look, if something negligent occurs, it's not going to be my guys. The landlord has a duty to fix, and it makes it easier to determine blame or responsibility to fix it. If you're a landlord watching this video, on the other hand, just make it very clear that any damage to the dock or those types of things are going to be repair expenses that the tenant is responsible for, and there are no capital expenses, and they're basically just an absolute guarantor of the condition of functioning docks. And I think that kind of economic outcome makes sense. The incentives are there for the tenant to hire good contractors because if they know that they're responsible for fixing the dock area, the loading area, then they're going to make sure that they have cameras on their third-party vendors and different suppliers coming up or clients taking away product. And so it's all about the economic incentives and making sure that your legal documents, I think, match those economic incentives. Parking spaces. This is, again, another bonus area for the lease to actually help you. You know, we typically will see reserved spacing, we will see numbered spacing, and if you have a survey of the site and a site plan, you have an absolute numbered guarantee of spaces. That's an obligation from the landlord, and you can put in your lease that if the parking is ever reduced, you get a pro rata reduction in the amount of rent that you have to pay per parking space if it is ever taken away from condemnation or another user or that sort of thing. So parking spaces, another area where your lease can help you as far as affirmative landlord obligations. Finally, the last thing to look for is location. You know, if you're looking for this space because of proximity and access to freeways, would that change based on anything that you require? So what I mean by that is if you have easy access to an access road to a major highway, and then suddenly the city takes that away or the landlord does something to take that away based on opening or closing different exits of the industrial complex, is that something that you want a rent reduction, or is that an affirmative obligation of the landlord? I don't know, but based on your particular needs, I know a lot of people care about access, and they can put that as an affirmative clause and an obligation of the landlord to keep that access point open. So that's it for top leasing tips before you sign your next warehouse or industrial lease. So smash that like button, subscribe if you want more industrial real estate content, and we'll see you next time.